Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello and welcome to Softcover, the print's platform to launch books online at a time the COVID-19 pandemic has made physical launches difficult. The book that you are launching today is titled The India Story, an epic journey of democracy and development. It is a Rupa publication and it is authored by Dr. Bimal Jalan. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. Dr. Jalan is the former governor of the Reserve Bank of India. He's also held many positions in the union government, including that of the finance secretary and the chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Dr. Jalan has also authored many books, the latest being his 14th book on India. So we will first unveil your book and then I'll ask you questions.
Thank you.
Congratulations, sir, on your book.
Thank you.
To start off, sir, I wanted to ask you that, what are the key lessons that India can learn from the 1991 crisis, the historic reforms that were undertaken at that time, especially given the fact that we are seeing the worst economic contraction at the moment due to the pandemic?
So far as this part is concerned, India after liberalization and what is happening now are completely different. In the sense, India after liberalization, and a lot of action was taken by the government to liberalize the economy, including, for example, lower interest rates, increasing investments, increasing imports, and releasing and doing a lot of other measures which could increase the amount of growth which India could have. So that is different. Here, this time, when you talk about the pandemic, that's completely different. It is that people could not have jobs because they could not get out of the house. Then you had the problem of food, problem of jobs. Jobs were also reduced and your unemployment rate was very high level. So don't compare the liberalization, post-liberalization, with what is happening today. Now, as you can see, what is happening today is also now being taken care of by the government. And in terms of COVID and everything else, there is much better position now than was, say, the case in March. So what I'm saying is that India liberalization, post-liberalization period was extremely good and very good things happened. And before that liberalization was, of course, the balance of payments crisis, which was the worst in India's history, balance of payments crisis. You couldn't pay even for food. You could not pay for anything. And therefore, India had to go to the IMF to take a loan and was extremely in trouble. But after 1991, July 1991, things changed. And now what is happening is very different.
Right. But sir, again, India is also seeing a sharp rise in its debt to GDP ratio. How worried do you think that the Indian government should be about this?
No, this is true, that India's debt to GDP ratio is around 80%, 90%. And it is, but in terms of the effect on the economy, it's very little, since it is entirely being financed by the fiscal policy. There is fiscal deficit, yes, and it's being financed by fiscal policy. But we are able to meet the amount of debt which we have, and that's not an issue which is creating any problem in India's growth rate at the moment. It's also that so far as debt is concerned and the fiscal policy is concerned, obviously, as you see, because of the fiscal policy, there is an increase in the rate of fiscal policy, fiscal deficit, and that has led to some impact on inflation at home. So those things are correct. But at the moment, we are below 180. And I think the best thing would be to reduce that. Of that, there is no doubt that to reduce the amount of of deficit, or to reduce the amount of debt equity ratio, debt to total investment ratio.
Okay, sir, this in this book you address many of the political and judicial reforms that should be undertaken. What kind of political reforms do you think that should be undertaken, especially now, given the fact that this is a government which is in power from since 2014, is in majority and not really running a coalition?
No, the real issue you have raised, a very important issue, which is what is the political role of the government. And I think it's a very important priority for the future is to reduce the political role of the government in the economy. For example, the government does everything. There is nothing you can't do, and there is nothing that you can do without the government's permission. So the amount of what you might say the political role of the government in the economy is increased substantially. If you look at the center and the states, even in the states, there is division of power between central and the states. There is central power, state power, and concurrent power. But what you find is that even what is happening in the states is being decided by the center. So that's an issue which needs to be tackled. Then, of course, in terms of political things, there are a number of other issues. For example, the functioning of parliament, functioning of I think you're putting the question on that also. Functioning of parliament into Rajya Sabha, the election of people to Rajya Sabha and all that. Those are the issues which need to be tackled. The other thing is about small parties. There is small parties now can shift from one party to other, and to a large party they can shift. So there is if you are a small party, you are more powerful than if you are a member of a large party, and you can shift. So you need to take some political reforms in that level also. That if you are a small party, you can't, and you have won elections from the people on the basis of that party, then you can't shift to another party without seeking elections.
Okay.
So we need a lot of political reforms, and as India's BOP is now very strong, it is desirable to introduce an aggressive open economy, that we should be much more open than we are. In terms of import duties and all that, we can now remove it, or keep it low, not remove, but lower, and which is happening. So there should be a lower level of protection in the economy, I think.
That seems to be the opposite of what the current government is doing. The level of protectionism seems to be increasing rather than decreasing. I
think that we have to think about it. The current government has a majority and it can do whatever it wants to do. But, it is an issue that requires action.
Right. So in the book, you also talk about the silence of Parliament and how, many bills kind of don't get really debated in Parliament and then get, passed in a rush. How worrying is this? Especially, even given, the recent farm laws also, if you see, there was hardly any debate in Parliament, it was just rushed through.
That's right. You see, the Parliament, the whole logic of Parliament was that there are three agencies. You see, judiciary, legislature, and executive. And executive is entirely responsible to Parliament. And they are members of Parliament. Otherwise, you can't be there running the executive. So the main issue that you have to think about is that why is the role of the Parliament decreased? And it has decreased because of if there is a majority government, it can also pass anything by ordinance, as has happened in India. That you passed anything without going to Parliament and then put it in Parliament. And because you have a majority, you will get the votes of Parliament. So that's wrong. That Parliament, and if you look at the majority part, and then you look at the small parties, the gap is too much. And this is what happens, is that if you have 5 members or 6 members, you make a small party. And then you would shift around. You can earn money, by from here to there, depending on which district you are in. So that is a problem and I think it's an important matter which the government should review and Parliament should review. Parliament should decide. that all that you can't just pass ordinance by your majority with the government with the president's approval. You you have to talk about it in parliament and then do something based on what the
Right. So, you also mentioned the need for bureaucratic reforms, the need to hold the bureaucracy accountable while also, ensuring that they deliver while protecting their rights.
No, but that's an extremely important issue. You see that everything which is done is by ministers.
Right.
Bureaucrats are consulted. That is true. But the bureaucrats themselves don't have any, even after the policy has been announced. It is not bureaucrats which can make any decision without the approval of the government. But the government can make any decision without the consensus of the bureaucracy. The advantage of bureaucracy is only that it's not only voting. That you have had experience in the past and you can do it. And if you don't do and you think that you can't do what needs to be done by a bureaucrat, then you can always transfer him or her. So that is also wrong. And then that prevents bureaucracy from giving its own opinion. So administratively, this can create a lot of trouble and a lot of, not trouble is not the right word, but a great deal of what you might say, the lack of focus in the bureaucracy on trying to do what is otherwise good from the country's point. It's not about minister not approving. It's about minister taking a decision on his or her own. Even if from the administrative point of view, that is wrong decision.
The government and the bureaucracy have been having a very tight hold on public sector enterprises, but now there's this whole talk of the government reducing its presence in many sectors, the government actually privatizing many of the state-owned enterprises. Do you think that this time around the government will be able to do it? It seems to have shown the political will, but there's the long gap between actually an announcement being made and the final privatization being done.
No, you are right, but I think that is a good thing. Privatization per se is a good thing. The only point that I would make to you is that the government has two different kinds of activities. One is to provide services to the people as a whole. And for example, food supply or Madhuriga or things where you can get jobs or you can get something. So those are for the underprivileged classes. You have to provide jobs. You have to ensure that there is no unemployment or very high unemployment, and the government has to enter that picture. So what I'm trying to say essentially is that in the old bureaucratic framework, you should listen to the bureaucrats. If you don't like what they have said or they have suggested, then you still consult them, but do it, after consultation, that you say, no, I don't agree with you, and this is it. But you can't say, I will transfer you. This can only happen if some bureaucrat has done the wrong thing.
Do you think this privatization drive will work, sir, this time around? There were announcements that were made.
You can't stop privatization from working because privatization in public sector firms. Now you can decide, you can say, and that's a very important point. That is why the public sector banks are under the total control of different ministries and who don't have the experience of running enterprises. We have 77 ministers now, and you have public sector entities. And public sector entities provides you with a lot of means of handling your, voting power and other things, because you can get donations and so on and so forth from the public or whatever it is. So what I'm trying to say essentially is that the government must decide on policy as well as control over public sector firms. But it would be nicer, it would be good if the amount of what the public sector banks do, you decide on policy, you decide on accountability, but don't do the nitty-gritty of this whole policy formation execution. That you leave to the enterprises. The board should be responsible, and that can be done, as in the private sector enterprises. You see, we have seen the corporate sector, private sector, and many of our own public sector enterprises, where the board decides whether things are happening as per the announced programs. The boards do that. But the execution of the policy that you have enunciated, or whatever it is left to the persons in power, or in the bureaucratic power.
Right. So, on privatization of state-owned banks, the budget this year announced that 2 state-owned banks will also be privatized. Do you think that's a good move, especially given the kind of powers that the RBI enjoys over private sector banks and that it doesn't enjoy over state-owned banks?
Yeah, no. But I think that what you have to decide, what you have to think about, is that what is it that I am removing privatization from? You see, in the sense that if you have something which is of interest to the public, like food supply, as I mentioned, and Noriga, I mentioned, the management of all this has to be with the government. But you don't have to interfere in deciding that if supposing where the investment should take place. You can leave to the enterprises based on their experience, based on their choices, and make them accountable, make them responsible. This is what you do in large private sector entities.
So, but state-owned banks, state-owned banks are also used by the government to deliver many of their schemes, their social security schemes, right? So that is also one reason why.
Yes, that's also extremely important. What I'm saying is that from the country's point of view, anything which is required in the interest of the country as a whole. For example, the whole functioning of the security part. What I'm saying is the security of the country and so on and so forth. That has to be done by the public sector. What you have to provide through the public sector in terms of subsidies, that has to be done by the public sector. And we have 300 million poor people below the poverty line. Now, whatever you are doing to try and reduce the extent of poverty has to be done from the public sector.
Right. So coming to financial sector reforms and the whole financial sector, the last few years have not been really good for the financial sector. There's been one scam after the other. Many financial institutions, a couple of financial institutions have actually collapsed. How worried the regulator should be, and how much can we really blame the regulator for these scams and for the failure of some of these institutions?
This is a very important point you've raised. But the important point here is that if you look at the large companies or something which have actually gone down or which have become insolvent, there are very few of them. If you look at the public sector as a whole, it's not true that this is happening in a large scale. You see what I mean? On the large, you see the scale of it. And India's financial system has a great deal of reputation internationally also. Financial system is stable. You can see this. The financial system is stable. The RBI is regulating. Your interest rates are in the reasonable bond. You may have 0.5% increase in the RBI zone of interest rate. But all these are comfortable. So what I'm trying to say is that from the financial system's point of view, we are in a good shape. And India has a very small financial system in compared with the rest of the world.
So, but the regulator has been under a lot of criticism, right? To the fact that, it failed to check the scams on time, it failed to intervene on time, especially related to the NBFC crisis.
No, but this is true. But NBFC has also been, what I'm saying essentially is they will take it as a whole. In the financial sector, for example, you are including, you have banks, you have your own current account and savings accounts and everything else. All that is functioning. So what I'm saying is the financial sector as a whole is functioning. And if there has been a problem, then you have to tackle it at the micro level. And NBFC is a different thing. But they are not regulated as much by RBI as are normal banks. And the RBI has done a good job, even if I say so, in terms of regulating banks and being them accountable for the function that they are doing. They do a lot of consultation and a lot of review of the large banking system in the country's interest. Yeah.
Also on the non-performing assets, there's a fear that banks may see their non-performing assets increasing once the regulatory forbearance ends, and because of the kind of stress that the pandemic has brought. What do you think? How big this problem could be going forward?
It's a trouble, certainly, and we have had NPAs, and that is part of the problem with the COVID part. That is that you have NPAs because the banks, etc., the demand side is not high. That the household sector, etc., they are not borrowing as much as they used to because they don't have jobs, they don't have, all kinds of things, as you know. So what I'm saying essentially is, at the moment, the NPAs have increased and RBI has expanded the time for them to resolve it. But you're right that this level of NPAs is not good. And we have to ensure that it gets better. But the main question at the moment is the pandemic part also. And we have to see, it's a supply-demand thing. And you may have the supply, but not as much demand.
Right. You also in your book mentioned the need for tightening prudential norms for banks. Do you think there's a need for another asset quality review that, like the one that was undertaken in 2015, that actually showed the true level of NPAs in banks?
No, but you should always show the true level of NPAs on that. There is no doubt. But 2015 thing was different. You see, at the moment, the regulatory system is functioning quite well. If you see how many banks have failed or what has happened, it's not too many. And of course, it is always necessary for the government and RBI to review asset quality and ensure that the financial system remains strong and valid. Of that, there is no doubt.
And so when you talk about tightening of prudential norms, do you mean higher provisioning?
No, both. You see, it can be higher provisioning, but higher provisioning has a problem because you don't get any returns on that provisioning.
Right.
So we have to control the NPAs, but you have to apply your mind to whether the NPAs are regular because of some fundamental problems and issues or lack of vigilance, or is it because of supply-demand question, and in which the supply is higher simply because the demand is lower, even from what you might say households. It's not the corporate sector or large companies.
Right. So, given the current state of public sector banks, do you think it's a good idea for the government to outrightly privatize these banks, or actually bring down its share, through secondary share sales by, reducing its holding of listed banks, sell them in the open market rather than actually privatizing a bank?
No, but this is again what I have said, is that you have to decide what the bank is doing. Because different banks have different options and different kind of works that they do. If the banks are not doing things in public interest, and I think I keep on repeating it, that you have two kinds of banks. One may be very large banks which have a lot of demand in corporate sector and all that, and then they are accountable to their corporates. Then you have smaller banks, and if you have banks which are not very large, then you have to make sure that it is in the public interest. Otherwise,
do you favor using the stock markets in terms of secondary share sales, where the government still holds a substantial stake, but say around a 30-40% stake rather than a majority stake? Or is it better to, even for these small banks?
No, I think that, I keep on repeating that point, that you concentrate on what is in the public interest.
Mm-hmm.
So there is that in our country, any country, there are two different levels at which policy has to respond to in terms of financial sector or in terms of whatever it is. One is the public interest. If it is public interest, then, and if it is for the people who are below the poverty line, then you can do whatever is necessary to try and resolve that issue, or try not resolve, but to meet that issue. And the other is competitive system, large competitive system.
And so my last question to you, on the whole judicial reforms, you've talked about the large pendency of cases in courts, the need for faster disposal of cases, and also interestingly pointed out on how many of these cases may actually be there because of the fact that executive has a lot of discretionary powers. So could you talk a little bit about this, and what do you actually propose to in the direction of judicial reforms?
No, there you are absolutely right, that judiciary reforms are essential. But you have to change when we say judicial reforms, you have to make a distinction between judicial reform and policy reform. It is not that the judges are not working. It is not that the judges have wrong policy. I'm saying that there may be judges who are not as competent as others and so on and so forth. But here the main issue is the pyramidal nature of judicial access to the people, which is, if you look about the people, it's okay. You see, you can do what you like, and you start from districts. Districts, then you can go to the High Court, then you can go to the lower courts, then you can go to the somewhere else, and then even if you lose, you can go to the Supreme Court. So the whole idea is that everybody goes up from bottom to the top. Now you see in some other countries, some other important countries, particularly the US, and to some extent in the UK also, and some other countries, that you have this, that you could go to the Supreme Court, for example. There should be a case which is of public interest and not of private interest. Mm-hmm. Unless it is of a very high level at which jobs would be lost if something happens. Jobs may not just 5 jobs, 10 jobs, 20 jobs, but say very many jobs with a large corporate or large public sector. Then you can have a case there. So what I'm trying to say is that it would be good if this is not pyramid, that Supreme Court, and I'm not a judiciary expert, but as a person, if you have cases, it's not, now you can have a case and go up. But judiciary should look at this thing, whether it's fundamentally important for the country, for the public, for the poor, and so on and so forth, and then accept the case.
And so the last part of my question, on the executive's discretionary powers, you've also talked about the discretionary powers of the executive in your book.
Yeah, no, but the discretionary powers of the executive, you define what is discretionary. You see, discretionary power of the executive is not that because you are an executive and you can fix jobs or do something, therefore you can fix jobs of your own friends and take bribes and fix jobs of some corporate people. You have to say that, that in the whatever is interested in the public interest should be done. Do you see what I mean?
Right, sir. Your whole focus is that reform should be in public interest, as in what you're doing, public interest should be the focus of the government's actions.
Focus, and in the sense that you take action from outside. I mean, I'm just talking about taking action, which is not your personal action. You can decide to be, you can decide to do whatever you want to do in terms of either becoming a speaker or or a speaker about the country's situation, and you speak and give it to the journalist, or you can be somebody who is asking questions, like you are doing now.
Yes, sir. Fair enough. Thank you so much, sir, for taking out time and for the conversation. All the best, sir, for your book.
No, but it is a great pleasure. And I'm glad. I'm very glad that you were launching my book, as it were. Not launching, but that it is that this book will receive more attention than would be the case otherwise.
All right, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
No, I appreciate it. All your questions were very relevant. I'm honestly telling you.